Hey Tom, how's it going, man?
I'm great. How are you?
Hey, you look good. Are you like somewhere for the draft and you have a big day today? Like you look sharp today.
This is the round the clock coverage on NFL Network. Look right here. Start out no tie in the morning, just to make everyone feel comfortable, and then we class it up a little bit in the afternoon.
Do you fix your own hair? I struggle with that because I do an okay amount of TV, but I don't know how to fix my hair unless somebody fixes it for me. And my hair's kind of long. Are you good at your own hair at this point?
You have to be. I mean, I do my own makeup 90% of the time. That's one thing that's different here is we actually have people handling that part of the job who know more to do than just like that. But the hair, the secret is coconut oil. That's how you get the all day shine. You get a little bit of coconut oil, you kind of work it in, and it just has a way of sticking and making it look like you always got fresh out of the shower, even if you've been going for 12 hours straight.
Yeah, I'm not even making a joke. Like it looks great. I'm looking at Tom like, God dang, dude. And right now you must be on call, basically like a doctor, right? Especially with the draft for sure, but the Aaron Rodgers news that broke, I'm imagining your phone's going off nonstop.
Yeah, I mean, this is always an interesting time of year because there is a pressure point with a lot of these things, like the Aaron Rodgers trade, where if it didn't get done before the draft, then you were going to go into crazy town, and that thing could have taken the entire summer. So, on a personal level, there's a sense of relief when things get wrapped up right about now, and you just try to have a sense for when exactly they're going to take place. There's always things you don't see coming. I mean, the Aaron Rodgers trade ultimately it was largely a matter of when, not if. There's other things that will pop up out of nowhere, and you just got to kind of react as quickly as possible when those things happen. But it's always good again to clear something that's been saved in my Twitter drafts for months. Just like waiting, make sure it's there, make sure it's updated, and then you do your best to have fast fingers and jump on TV.
Let's start with Aaron Rodgers. Why did it take so long to get done? And, there was more than just Rodgers going to the Jets, and there was, a conditional part of that as well. How do you feel? Who do you think won this thing?
I think it's a win-win, and I had that conversation last night because listen, the Jets had to get Aaron Rodgers. There's way too much into it. It's too late to add some other quarterback to your roster. You're not going to be able to go back to Zach Wilson, not at this stage. Even though I think that this is actually a good thing for him because him and Rodgers have a good relationship. But he was not ready. They were not going to have full confidence. That media market is so hard. They couldn't go back to Zach. So what are you going to do? You had to pay the price for the Packers. They had been looking to get a second round pick this year, which they did, number 42. And then they wanted an unconditional number one in the 2024 draft. So a hard one. It became apparent in the past few days the Jets were just not going to get to the hard one. And so there had to be a kicker. And what they settled on was the 13-15 flop in the first round. So the Packers move up two spots. And then the kickback to the Jets was in the fifth and sixth rounds they flip picks there too, and the Jets move up a bunch of spots from the sixth round to the fifth. And these are always like I understand like when those words are coming out of my mouth, it seems like it's just kind of silly and why does it come down to that? But these are complicated trades. These are like legacy making types of deals. The Packers got a substantial haul for a player who, by his own admission, was ready to retire before he came to the conclusion the Packers didn't want him back. And, he decided to come back, at least in part, it seems like out of spite. The Jets want him. They got an offensive coordinator, Nathaniel Hackett, who Aaron's really close with. They signed one of his good buddies, Alan Lazard, and they got a really talented young core. So I think everybody ends up getting what they wanted. And how Aaron Rodgers plays in New York is going to go a long way toward telling you what the final history is on this trade. Just like it may take some time, but how things play out with Jordan Love and knowing that was kind of the butterfly effect that trading up to draft him in 2020 had on the Aaron Rodgers situation as a whole. It's something we'll be tracking for years to come.
With Zach Wilson, do you think the Jets feel like he can learn and can still be the guy after he does learn? Or is he just going to be a backup until they get another guy once Rodgers is out in possibly 2, 3 years if he retires then?
No, I think that's the part that got missed here was listen, Nathaniel Hackett is going to embrace having a project in Zach Wilson because Zach Wilson's really talented. Like in terms of just a thrower, in terms of how he can, move around and change his arm angle and make things happen on off schedule, off balance, off every platform. He can do all that stuff. It's just been the consistency. I think that Robert Salo referred to it one time as he's got to make the layups. It's just been like being able to execute the things that you have to do in that offense when you got all these weapons around you. That's what's eluded Zach Wilson to this point in his career. So he grew up idolizing Aaron Rodgers. They talked at the joint practice, I think it was last year, maybe it was 2 years ago, and you know, it was a cool moment for Zach Wilson. Well, now they're teammates. Aaron's at a point in his career. He's not going to have a problem taking Zach under his wing, at least to a certain degree. And again, Hackett's going to embrace trying to develop the guy. You hope that he's not going to have to play this year, but God forbid if something were to happen to Aaron Rodgers, I think that having months of reps through the offseason under his belt and having a little bit of time to breathe and watch one of the best quarterbacks to ever do it, it's all going to be a good thing for Zach Wilson. The final book on Zach Wilson has not yet been written. If the Jets have their way, though, of course, there will not be a chapter in 2023. It'll be all A-Rod all the time.
One more of these before we get to the draft. The next one up, waiting in line, is Lamar. When's that breaking? Is it going to break? What's happening as far as you know?
Well, with Lamar Jackson, everything has happened backwards from what you would normally see take place here. You go back to 2 years ago, and it's well documented Lamar doesn't have an agent. Lamar Jackson, former NFL MVP, in his fourth season, played for $1.7 million with the Ravens. No agent anywhere would have said, you're going to play for $1.7 million. They all would have said, we're getting the deal done right now. People made fun of Kyler Murray's agent, Eric Burkhart, last year for the manifesto that he put out at the Combine and the way that became a very public dispute. But guess what? Kyler Murray, a player who organizationally, it's very apparent, contractually and otherwise, that they had reservations about making him the franchise guy and paying him. They paid him at a really high level. And then Kyler ends up, tearing his ACL, and you're obviously happy at that point that you took the money when you could get it, and you got that, the money train rolling. I understand the push for the fully guaranteed contracts. Okay, it's something that has to happen based upon individual contract precedent. Deshaun Watson last year, under very unique circumstances, facing serious allegations of sexual misconduct, but also being a highly talented player who was basically a free agent because 4 different teams were all able to bid on him and bid against each other until Cleveland finally went, after being told you're out, said, well, what if we do this? That's how they got Deshaun Watson. With Lamar Jackson, though, the thing you have to understand is quarterback is not a guarantees position. It is a cash flow position. And so by playing for 1.7 in 2021, by coming back and playing for 23 in 2022, he's already put himself tens of millions of dollars in the hole. And that's money that you're not going to get back. And oh, by the way, you're also that much further from getting back to the negotiating table and getting to your next deal. So now you get into 2022. They've been negotiating for months. Nothing happens. He ends up playing it out for $23 million. Now we're into 2023. They've got really no option but to franchise tag him because Lamar, at a base level, his entire negotiating stance has been, I'm better than Deshaun Watson. I deserve a better contract, which is understandable on an emotional level, but that's not how contracts work. Contracts are based on a lot of factors, including leverage. And Deshaun Watson, despite everything that he was facing at the time, had a unique level of leverage here. So Lamar, even before he got franchise tagged, requested a trade, which doesn't make any sense because the only way to trade Lamar Jackson, who's about to be franchise tagged, is if he works out a contract with a new team. Lamar, by getting the non-exclusive tender, could already negotiate with all the teams. And to this point, has not, to my or anyone else's knowledge, come even close to signing an offer sheet because he's got certain contractual demands that are not in line with what a lot of teams can do, for one thing, that they can afford based on how their roster is composed, but also not an area that teams want to go in. And that's without mentioning the past 2 years, Lamar Jackson got hurt toward the tail end of the season. He is a remarkably dynamic player. He is fun to watch. He's accomplished things that Kyler Murray had when he got paid last year. He's won a playoff game. He's won an MVP. But in order for anything to happen with Lamar Jackson, step one is negotiate the contract. Lamar doesn't have an agent. His mom's his advisor. There's a guy named Ken Francis, who's his business partner, who at one point was contacting teams about this. None of this quite logically fits. And that's why I also think it's difficult to sit here and say what Lamar will do if no offer sheet comes and you get to July and August. Is he showing up? The franchise tender is $32 million and change. So you're talking about $2 million per game. Is he going to give that up when just a couple of years ago he was playing for a fraction of that? I don't know. All you can really use as your guide is his recent actions, which is actively participating in pursuing Odell Beckham Jr. to Baltimore, continuing even after he tweeted about his trade request for March 2nd, continuing to negotiate that week with the Ravens. You have to say Lamar's preparing as if he's going to be back in Baltimore, despite what he put in those tweets saying goodbye to everyone there. It's impossible to say exactly what direction he's going to go because, again, logic has not really dictated his moves to this point.
Yeah, it feels very inconsistent to me too. I'm glad you kind of walked through that because it seems like a lot of his actions were extremely inconsistent for what he was asking, what he wanted, and what he was doing. So I guess that's what happens when you don't have an agent. I got a great agent. He tells me what to do. So I guess that's the difference in me and him. Let's talk about the draft. Let's start with I just feel, and you probably feel too, that it's Bryce Young at 1. I don't know if there's much discussion to have there, but I think 2, now it's starting. I don't know. Is it moving a little bit? Is it fluid where it may not be C.J. Stroud to the Texans?
Well, I would start with Bryce Young. It would be a shock to people within the league sitting here on Tuesday if Bryce Young is not the number 1 overall pick to Carolina. His height, his size, notwithstanding, he checks every other box the teams look for in a franchise quarterback. And when I talk to coaches, GMs, other executives, scouts from over 20 teams in the NFL, almost everybody had Bryce Young as the number 1 quarterback. There is question at number 2. And the honest answer is no one is entirely certain what the Texans are going to do. About a week or so ago, there were rampant rumors, information, whatever you want to call them, where every GM who was calling me was saying that they heard the Texans are not going to take a quarterback at number 2, which makes some sense because they got DeMeco Ryans. He needs really good players up front on his defense to make his scheme go. He's a new head coach. They might think there's only a couple, 2 or 3, depending whose board you're talking about, truly elite defensive players in this draft. If you pass on 1 and 2, you're not getting one of those guys. They also have the number 12 pick, so potentially you got a quarterback who falls in your lap later, or you could even trade up from 12. Nick Caserio, who's the GM, has been calling around for weeks, talking to teams about different scenarios, both moving back from 2 and moving up from 12. If I had to guess right now, my guess would be Will Anderson would be the number 2 pick, and that they would find a way to get a quarterback of some kind elsewhere within those top, whatever it is, 8, 10, 12 picks, depending if they trade up. With C.J. Stroud, I think that the conversation has gotten skewed in part by the results of the S2 cognition test, which is this new test the teams have been giving over the past handful of years. Some teams put a lot more stock in it than others. He had a low score on that test, but to be clear, it's not an intelligence test. It measures things like impulse control, distraction control, visual learning, tracking ability, and it's basically meant to, in part, determine how this person learns and how you should teach them moving forward. So every coach that I talked to that spent time with C.J. Stroud said he's been excellent on the board. There's no processing issues on tape. So is it just not his type of test? Is it a red herring along the way? It's certainly something the teams are aware of, but it's not an end-all be-all. With C.J. Stroud, it really comes down to there is a bias against Ohio State quarterbacks in general because we've seen them, quarterbacks not asked to do a lot in that system, but C.J. Stroud had more responsibility in terms of checks at the line of scrimmage and things than a lot of other quarterbacks have had in that scheme. He's way more polished of a passer than Justin Fields was coming out a few years ago. He's just not as dynamic of a runner. He's not a runner at all. C.J. Stroud, you look at his rushing stats in college, I think he had 1 career rushing touchdown. And, sacks count against rushing stats at the college level, but he had like negative rushing yards for his career. He really didn't use his legs a whole lot. There was some frustration from scouts who would say, we know he can move, but he's throwing the ball away instead of just running for a first down sometimes. He showed in the Georgia game, the last game of his college career, some of those abilities. And he can throw it. He's really good making plays on the move. It's just a matter of, philosophically, do you want to have somebody who's more of a pocket passer, because that's what CJ Stroud is. Can you get over the learning curve he's going to have coming from Ohio State? Again, did really well in the meetings with teams. He's a little bit guarded at times. If leadership was something he had to grow into at Ohio State, but the more time the team spent with him, the more they liked CJ Stroud. All of which is to say, I don't see CJ Stroud sliding far. I don't know that he goes number 2. He well could end up in Houston one way or another, whether it's with their first pick or their second pick in the first round. But sitting here right now, I would say my belief, and could be wrong, okay, just my belief based on talking to a lot of people around the league, I think all 4 of those quarterbacks, Bryce Young, CJ Stroud, Will Levis, Anthony Richardson, if I had to guess, I would say they're all off the board in the first 12 picks, in part because obviously there's not a lot of quarterbacks in general. Those guys tend to get pushed up, but also there's just not a lot of elite non-quarterbacks who you can argue to push ahead of somebody who, if you believe in one of these guys that he can be a franchise type of guy, it's really, really hard to pass up.
The Texans, you say, have that 12th pick, and what if they trade back to later in the first, but take a Hendon Hooker, right, who's his injuries, what's kind of being held against him right now more than anything else. I mean, is that a possibility where instead of trading up to get one of those guys, that they're bullish enough on Hendon Hooker to go, we like him enough to take him at 20, 21?
Well, and that's always the game, right? Is do you want to take the risk? If you think somebody could be a franchise quarterback, there are times where you get too cute with it and move back and end up missing out on the player. And Hooker's going to be one of the fascinating stories to me in this entire draft because, yes, he tore his ACL back in November. He's still not running full speed at this point. He's going to be cleared right around the start of the season. But most teams I've talked to say he's probably be a pup list guy. He's probably going to not be practicing through camp in the early portion of the season. Maybe around November, you kind of ramp him up. But you have to look at this season as a redshirt type of year. Well, if some team trades into the first round, or in your scenario, Houston moves back, or somebody like Minnesota at 23 likes him, by taking him in the first round, you get a 5th-year option, which for a guy who's probably not going to be ready to play this year can end up really being beneficial. He's also older. He's 25. I believe he turns 26 during the season. So there's that factor. And he comes from a Tennessee offense that coaches I've spoken to say is really hard to evaluate because it's a version of the air raid. The receivers line up outside the numbers on both sides. They were using hand signals where basically Hendon Hooker, who was previously in this really rigid scheme at Virginia Tech where everything was like the timing of the drop, ball comes out here. This scheme is like he looks over at the fast dudes he's got, Jalen Hyatt and Cedric Tillman. They give him a hand signal like, the receivers read the coverage, I'm going to run this route. And then Hendon, who throws a really good deep ball, just steps back there and rips it. It's the same drop every time. It's nothing like an NFL system. Things are going to be more complicated. Aptitude's not an issue here. It's just his development is going to be learning to play in an NFL offense where rhythm and timing and tempo are really important. So it's a projection, less so medically than all the other stuff that you've got to literally Hendon Hooker's agent may or may not be ringing me. I'll call him back. You have to figure out at what point are you comfortable taking that player, and that's what they're going to have to figure out.
Doesn't it benefit Hooker? And I haven't heard this, and you may tell me I'm a big old idiot, and you should text it back. Be like, I'm on the phone with an idiot right now, or on Zoom with an idiot. I'll call you right back. But Hooker learning the system at Virginia Tech, like I don't know that when everyone says, hey, he ran the air raid under Heupel at Tennessee, but he had to learn at Virginia Tech a different style of offense as well, like you mentioned, and that's got to be an asset for him that I don't feel like is being accounted for positively as much as it should. Do you feel like that factors at all, that he's had to learn 2 different systems?
Well, neither one really bears resemblance to an NFL system. I think that certainly the ability to pick things up quickly is important. And also, the leadership traits that Hendon showed once he got to Tennessee, because anytime a player, especially a quarterback, leaves, it was kind of under weird circumstances. Hendon Hooker's last game at Virginia Tech, he was, he was physically shaking on the sideline. He said it was a medication he got for a heart procedure, I believe it was related to lingering effects of COVID. It reactivated, and he had like this reaction that was visible on the TV broadcast, and then did not play there again. So odd circumstances, goes to Tennessee, immediately walked in, and he was the guy in that program. If you're betting on Hendon Hooker, It reminds me a little bit of like Trey Lance last year, where it's like Hendon Hooker is you're betting on the person because he's really likable. I spent a bunch of time around him at the Senior Bowl, extremely engaging. I like the way that he talks about football. He's obviously mature, which he should be. He's 25. He's 4 years older than some of these other dudes in the draft. But you're betting that listen, we can work with this person. It's just a matter of again with the injury, the scheme change, the age. Do you take him in the first, get that option, or are you more comfortable saying we'll take him in the second and the third? Where there's a bunch of other really intriguing guys, I think, in this draft too at that position. Once you get later in those rounds, I mean, Jake Hayner from Fresno State helped himself as much as any quarterback during the pre-draft process. Senior Bowl MVP. Another guy spent a lot of time around. Good dude, really interesting, super confident. He's been told his whole life if you were 2 inches taller, we'd recruit you, we'd give you all these opportunities. So major chip on his shoulder. He got some Brock Purdy comparisons when I was talking to people. One person compared him to Drew Brees as well in terms of sees it, ball comes out quickly. That's a trait that everybody's looking for.
All right, two quick questions. Then you got to handle your business for sure. Derrick Henry, what's the deal? Are you going to get traded? We went closer to the draft. Does he end up in Tennessee?
Well, Rand Carthon, the Titans GM, said yesterday he's not received any calls on Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry, obviously a fantastic player, 2,000-yard rusher, one of the tone setters in the league. He's also a running back who's getting older. I think he's 28. He's had a couple of injuries in recent years. And you really, if you're going to have him as the focal point of your offense, you got to commit to playing a certain style of football. There's not a lot of teams that play the type of physical smash mouth attack that Tennessee does. That's not to say that, if you're Philadelphia and you lost Miles Sanders in free agency, if you're Buffalo and you're trying to figure out how your backfield fits together, I mean, I could see the argument for bringing him in, but it's a matter of what type of price are you willing to pay? And then in turn, are the Titans willing to give up the player for that price? It's a lot of moving parts. We still got a couple of days till the draft. You would presume that Derrick Henry's contract, even though it's not off the charts by any stretch relative to the running back market right now, but you would think any team trading for him would want to touch that contract. So over the next couple of days here, that part of it would have to ramp up in order for him to be dealt.
Last question. What's the best situation team-wise for Anthony Richardson to land? Is it the Raiders because they got a guy in Jimmy G? If you were Anthony Richardson, where do you want to be?
Well, if I'm Anthony Richardson, I do want someplace I'm going to get a chance to develop. But I had one GM tell me recently, if you're taking him somewhere in the top 5, top 10 picks, you're talking about $30 to $35 million for this guy with totally rare tools. You're going to find a way for him to be on the field. Anthony Richardson, he may not be a starting quarterback and probably shouldn't be a starting quarterback, even though coaches and scouts say there's more on tape in terms of his pocket presence, processing, all that stuff. And he did really well in his interviews, too. He surprised some people because he's played so little football, surprised people with how much football he knows in meetings. I wouldn't be surprised at all if Anthony Richardson is playing in some capacity this season somewhere. I could see an argument to go into Seattle where you've got Geno Smith there. And his deal, even though I think it's a 3-year deal, it's really a 1-year, like $18 million deal. So potentially you could turn to Anthony Richardson in 2024. But they're drafted at number 5. That's a $35 million bet on a guy who started 13 college games and completed 55% of his passes. You get a little bit deeper into those picks. The Lions, they got Jared Goff. They like him a lot. That could be another good spot for an Anthony Richardson. The Raiders, that's going to be interesting because even though, yes, they got Jimmy Garoppolo, they paid him in such a way that he's really locked in as the starter for 2 years. When you do that and you make that level of commitment, it's hard to say we're then going to come back and use our top draft pick on the guy to play 3 years from now. So that one would surprise me a little bit. Tennessee, Ryan Tannehill, basically he's in a situation where he's due like $28 million, I think, this year and has no guarantees left. That could be a good spot. There's a bunch of different places, even Minnesota with Kirk Cousins. Now they're all the way down to 23. I think it's hard to believe that they're going to give up the type of capital it would take to vault all the way up into the top 12. But rule nothing out. Kwesi Adolfo-Mensah showed in his first draft he's not afraid to do things in sometimes an unorthodox fashion. Richardson going to be one of the really interesting stories, I think, in this entire draft. Will Levis probably goes higher than what everybody was thinking. C.J. Stroud probably goes right about where everybody was thinking. Anthony Richardson, you've got more variance just because there's a projection here. You're not going to be able to answer the questions you have about him prior to the draft. You're betting again on the person and the raw athletic skill set. At what point are you comfortable doing that? That's what we're going to find out on Thursday night.
You heard it here. Tom Pelissero said Anthony Richardson will play fullback for the Lions next year. That's right. Heard it here first. Hey, Tom, you're the best, man. I watch, listen, we have everybody on. I think you're the best at what you do. So congrats on really, you've launched into being in that premier tier, man. So big fan. You guys follow Tom at Tom Pelissero on all of it, Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Good luck with the draft, and we really appreciate the time that you gave us today.
Now, thanks a lot for having me on. This is fun.
See you, Tom.